Good morning. I'm very happy to be with you, and I'm sorry that I'm not physically in Washington. The reason for that is that Stanford is on a quarter system, and if you can believe it, the quarter has not yet ended, so I'm required to remain in California. I really do regret missing the conference because it's something I believe in. I was one of the founders of the American Interest magazine, and I have been a charter member of the democracy promotion community, having been a board member of the National Endowment for Democracy for the last 12 or 13 years. I believe very strongly in that overall mission. What I want to talk to you today about is really two topics. The first has to do with democracy as a means and democracy as an end. The second has to do with my view that we have underemphasized the importance of state capacity in thinking about political reform and the promotion of democracy around the world. Let me begin with topic one, democracy as a means and democracy as an end. Now, I think it's pretty clear we're in a very different period of global history. Walter Mead has written that we've seen the return of geopolitics with two big powers, Russia, an electoral authoritarian country, and China, a fully authoritarian one, both making territorial claims against their neighbors in the last few months. I think that neither the Russian nor the Chinese model in the long run is particularly sustainable, but unfortunately we have to survive the short run in order to get to the long run, and I think we're going to have some real foreign problems at both ends of Eurasia. In American foreign policy, there has for a long time been a tension between the intrinsic value of democracy promotion and democracy promotion as a tool of American foreign policy. I was always critical of the Bush administration's promotion, or the arguments made, particularly in Bush's second inaugural, that there was essentially no daylight between America's idealistic interest in democracy and its strategic interest in prosecuting the war on terrorism. I thought that this was a rhetorical mistake for a couple of reasons. That first of all, it tainted the activity of democracy promotion because it looked like a completely self-interested activity in a period when the United States was fighting a deeply unpopular war. But the second was also from the standpoint of American foreign policy because it made us look hypocritical, since the United States, in fact, had to make compromises between its principles and its strategic interests, particularly in an area like the Middle East. Now, however, I think we need to revisit this issue because it's simply different, and I think there is an underlying truth to Bush's assertion that is coming out at the present moment in Ukraine. There is really no distinction between the promotion and the encouragement of a consolidation of a liberal democracy in Ukraine and America's broader strategic interest in maintaining a free and open European order. I think the person that sees this connection between democracy promotion and strategic interest most clearly is actually Vladimir Putin. I think in retrospect, the color revolutions, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine and the Rose Revolution in Georgia back in 2004 were important turning points in his evolution to the authoritarian revanchist that he is now, because for him that indicated that democracy promotion was simply a tool of American foreign policy. He's the kind of person that cannot perceive the fact that you could have spontaneous popular uprisings against corrupt authoritarian rulers that actually reflect the wishes of people, as opposed to something that's simply externally manipulated by special services, as he's trying to do in eastern Ukraine today. And the fact of the matter is that in this particular case, those two interests are correct. In other cases, though, tension still exists. I believe, on balance, we actually have not taken Bush seriously enough, because I think we have consistently, in a country like Egypt, sided with whoever seemed in the short run to promise stability, rather than sticking to a longer-term principled position that we wanted democracy in that country, and that we wanted it precisely because it was an important American ally to rest on a legitimate basis. Nonetheless, in the Middle East and in Asia, there will be cases where our strategic interests and our interest in the principled interest, the intrinsic interest in promoting democracy will be at odds, and that is a balance that has to be renegotiated at every turn. The second topic that I want to address is the question of state capacity and the importance of states in the democracy promotion area. I think there are three basic components of political order. There's the state itself, which is really about the concentration and the ability to use power. The second has to do with the rule of law, which are rules that constrain the use of power. And the third is democratic accountability, that is to say, free and fair multi-party elections by which the state reflects the wishes of the broad public and not just the interests of the rulers. I think a successful liberal democracy needs to have all three of these in balance, because on the one hand, the power concentrating institution is necessary for public purposes, but it needs to operate according to the constraints imposed by law and by democratic accountability. I think that particularly Americans are likely to focus on the instruments of constraint rather than the power-generating institution. That is to say, we're very much focused on constraining states through human rights, through democratic elections, but we tend to not remember that, as Samuel Huntington once said, you cannot constrain power unless you can actually produce power and produce order in the first place. And I think there's a lot of empirical evidence that shows that actually of these three institutions, it's really the administrative capacity of states that has the most to do with things like economic growth, good, health, security, individual outcomes that are the basis for individual flourishing in a modern democracy. Boo Rothstein at Gothenburg has been very good, I think, at demonstrating that connection is much more powerful, unfortunately, than, for example, the connection between democracy and similar kinds of social outcomes. And I think we can see a lot of examples of this in recent years. Let's just begin with Ukraine. Everybody was very focused on the immediate transition to democracy back during the Orange Revolution in 2004. And in a sense, once the good guys came to power, everybody breathed a big sigh of relief and said, okay, that job is done. It turned out the good guys did not know how to govern their way out of the paper bag. They did nothing about corruption. They squabbled among themselves. They had no idea actually how to make the Ukrainian government into an effective organization that could deliver basic services to the Ukrainian population. And as a result, Viktor Yanukovych came back in a period when, had they consolidated their rule better, Vladimir Putin would have been too weak to really do anything about it as he is today. And I think you can see other examples of this. In India, when you compare it to China, everybody knows the problems in terms of economic growth, but basic services. There was a study done by Jean Drèze in the late 1990s that showed that 50% of Indian school teachers were not showing up to work, and despite the fact that they were getting paid. This led to a big hue and cry in the Indian press. India is a lively democracy. This should have led to greater accountability. And yet, 10 years later, when they did another empirical survey, it turned out the same number, 50% of school teachers were not showing up for work. This is not a problem of inadequate democracy. It is a problem of inadequate state capacity to deliver basic services. If you think about the resource curse, the difference between Norway and Nigeria entirely has to do with the quality of Norwegian institutions and the fact that they are strong enough to allocate natural resource events in a fair way. And finally, if you turn to the developed world, if you think about the crisis of the euro that we've just gone through, the real difference between Greece and I would say Italy on the one hand, and Germany and Scandinavia and other countries in Northern Europe on the other, really has to do with the quality of government. In Greece, and especially in southern Italy, you have this very strong survival of political clientelism and an inadequate state that cannot collect taxes, whereas something of the opposite prevails in Northern Europe. And that is why Greece and Italy could not control their budget deficits in the lead up to the euro crisis. And in general, I would say that the quality of government makes a much greater difference to outcomes than does the quantity of government. We Americans love to argue about big government and say it either should be larger if you're a Democrat or smaller if you're a Republican. I think empirically, there's a lot of data that shows that actually the size of the government matters much less to outcomes than the quality of the state sector. Prima facie, you can see this in comparing sub-Saharan Africa to Scandinavia. Scandinavia takes times more than 50% of GDP, takes it in through taxes and funnels it through the state. In sub-Saharan Africa, maybe 10 to 15% of GDP is taken in a similar way. And the outcomes in Scandinavia are obviously a lot better because the quality of government in that part of the world is a lot better. So I think that as democracy promoters, we need to focus on the consolidation phase and not simply to the transition phase. And that leaves us with a lot of problems because we don't really know how to do it all that well. Prevailing orthodoxy basically says that all good things go together, that if you want to end corruption, what you need is more transparency, that is to say information, and more democratic accountability. That's an okay theory as far as it goes. In theory, that ought to be correct for corrupt politicians if they know about them. But in fact, there's a lot of empirical evidence that by itself, more democracy and more transparency do not end up fixing that problem. And in fact, there is some reason to believe that expansion of democracy actually exists in some tension with the quality of government, because the latter really depends on things like expertise, capacity, a certain degree of state autonomy, which is not always compatible with demands for democratic participation. So I think we need to think this issue through much more carefully and look beyond the transitions to the building of capacity. That is to say, the ability of democracies to deliver. I should note, because I actually know what Joe Jaffe is going to be telling you in a later panel, I disagree with him in certain ways but I want to point out that the emphasis on state capacity is not by any means meant to imply that I am an advocate of authoritarian government or a particular admirer of countries like China or Singapore. I think that administrative capacity is a component of good government, whether your government is authoritarian or democratic. The simple fact that you're authoritarian does not give you added state capacity. There are many low-capacity, incompetent, corrupt authoritarian governments. China's government stands out because compared to North Korea, Zimbabwe, many other places, they have strong administrative capacity. It's not constrained, and that's what makes it a dictatorship, but they have capacity. Similarly, not all democracies have capacity. Norway and Denmark have a lot of state capacity, and Greece does not, and that's why Norway and Denmark are doing better than Greece at the present moment. And so I think we need to get past the whole democracy versus authoritarian government argument and think a little bit about the state and the way that states function and the relationship between the three components of the state, rule of law, and democratic accountability, because if the balance shifts too far to the states, you get China, Russia with overweening, unconstrained states. But if you move too far to the other direction, you get indecisive, corrupt, and ultimately feckless governments that also undermine their own legitimacy because they cannot give people what they essentially want out of a liberal democracy. So thank you. I apologize again for not being able to be with you in person and wish you the best for the conclusion of the conference.